I was born in Rosario, a city that smells of dust, diesel, and devotion. My father worked as an accountant for the railway. My mother sold candles outside the cathedral. Every evening, she'd come home with the scent of wax clinging to her hands, and I'd count how many candles she'd sold, how many pesos she'd tucked into her apron. Numbers fascinated me, even then. They were like prayers, small, precise, obedient. When the military fell and democracy returned, Argentina was still trembling, unsure of its own reflection. The priests spoke of renewal, of the need to heal not only the body, but the spirit of the nation. I believed them. At 12, I wanted to be one of them, to be the man in the collar who could give people order in their chaos. My father didn't laugh when I told him. He just nodded and said, "Then learn the discipline of details." God forgives sin, but He doesn't forgive sloppy accounting. That sentence would become my gospel. I entered seminary at 19. It was a strange world. Silent corridors, Latin prayers, and the constant echo of shoes on tile. The professors spoke of sin as an abstraction, but I saw it as arithmetic. Each lie subtracted a piece of the soul. Each act of kindness added a fraction back. I believed one could balance anything with enough intention. The other seminarians admired my precision. My notes were neat, my homilies orderly. I became known as the one who could make faith sound rational. But beneath that praise, a small vanity began to bloom. I liked being the reliable one, the one superiors could trust. And when you enjoy trust too much, you start needing it. After ordination, they sent me to Córdoba, first as an assistant in a parish, then to a small orphanage, San Miguel, on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a holy place at first glance. The paint peeled from the walls, and the courtyard was filled with weeds taller than the children. There was no choir, no marble, no stained glass, just the persistent smell of boiled lentils and disinfectant. But when I saw the children, 30 of them, from toddlers to half-grown teenagers, I felt something rise in my chest. It wasn't pride, it was purpose. I believed God had chosen me not for grandeur, but for repair. The sisters welcomed me with relief. The previous priest had died of pneumonia, leaving the accounts in chaos. Papers were scattered across a desk like leaves in a storm. I spent my first night sorting them. Each column, each missing signature felt like a moral wound waiting for closure. When the sun rose, I knelt before the small altar and whispered, "I will bring order here, Lord. I will make the numbers sing for you." Years passed. I became Padre Emilio Salvatierra, a name the city would later curse. But back then, it meant something beautiful. I was disciplined, the kind of priest who arrived before dawn, who double-checked every invoice, who walked the dormitories at night to ensure the children were warm. I was strict, but they trusted me. They saw in me a man who believed rules were kindness. My faith was structural, architectural. It had clean lines and measurable outcomes. I wanted God to be efficient, and I wanted to help Him manage His kingdom better. I didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't indulge in gossip. Yet under that discipline was an unspoken arrogance, the quiet pride of a man who believes virtue is a personal achievement. There were signs I refused to see. One day, Sister Magdalena, the oldest nun at San Miguel, told me, "Father, sometimes faith grows better in chaos." I smiled and said, "Then God should hire better accountants." She didn't smile back. The first crisis came during an especially harsh winter. Prices for milk and flour doubled overnight. Donations slowed. Electricity bills rose. We had to choose between heat and food. I stayed awake 3 nights straight, reading through the orphanage ledgers, searching for a miracle in numbers. Finally, I found it. An unspent grant meant for infrastructure repairs. I redirected it to food and medicine. It was a small act of rebellion, technically dishonest but morally pure. I even wrote the bishop a letter explaining the adjustment. He never replied. When the next month's balance arrived, I repeated the trick, moving pesos from one line to another, massaging reality until it looked righteous. It was exhilarating in a quiet way. Each lie was wrapped in justification. For the children, for survival, for faith. I slept well that night. The children thrived. For the first time in years, they had meat twice a week. They stopped coughing at night. The orphanage felt alive, and so did I. Parishioners began calling me El Cura de los Pobres, the priest of the poor. Donors came to visit. Journalists wrote small features about miracles of management. The bishop shook my hand in public. And that single gesture lit something dangerous inside me. Pride disguised as grace. I began to believe that morality could be engineered, that holiness was a matter of good administration. That was when the faith I'd built on paper began to crack. There was a memory I can't shake. My father, sitting at the kitchen table, balancing his accounts by candlelight. He'd found an error, a missing decimal point. He could have hidden it. No one would have noticed. But he sighed, erased the page, and started again. "Numbers tell the truth, Emilio," he said, "even when we don't." That memory used to comfort me. Later, it would haunt me. As the winter thawed, I told myself the worst had passed. The children were fed, the lights were on. But there was something in the silence of the chapel at night, a heaviness I couldn't name. I'd sit before the crucifix, the candles flickering, and whisper, "If the lie keeps them alive, is it still a sin?" The question echoed through the empty church. God, as always, was silent. And I mistook that silence for permission. The first year I ran San Miguel taught me that faith is less a flame than a stubborn ember, kept alive by breath, by hands that refuse to stop cupping it against the wind. We never had enough. Not enough bread, not enough blankets, not enough patience when small boys cried from nightmares inherited from parents they no longer had. But we had order. And order, I told myself, was how the ember survived. Order impressed donors. I learned this quickly. On visiting days, I arranged our most presentable children in the sun. Clean shirts, brushed hair, one guitar. We practiced a song with claps and a chorus about gratitude. The littlest ones were taught to run forward to hug visitors at a signal from Sister Anna. This was not deceit, I argued with myself. This was choreography for benevolence. Did the world not ask for spectacle before mercy? And if yes, was I not obliged to provide it? It worked. Coins fell heavier. Checks arrived in envelopes perfumed by lives far from ours. Each donation came with its own subtext. A company logo angled toward the camera. A family that wanted their name on a plaque. a politician seeking a gentle photograph with children he would not remember in 2 days. I took it all. I told the sisters, every motive is purified in the mouth of a hungry child. They did not argue out loud. That winter of shortfalls, my first redistribution of funds, left a mark on me harder than any bruise. I had crossed a rule and nothing broke. The sky did not darken. The crucifix did not weep. When the children ate meat and slept without coughing, I felt the most dangerous consolation. Outcomes vindicate methods. The ledger had become a rosary. The beads slid easily through my fingers. Small permissions became my liturgy. A rounding here, a delayed receipt there. If a supplier wrote 37,200, I recorded 39,000 and bought asthma medicine with the difference. If an invoice went missing, I replaced it with one that should have existed and told God the truth of intent counted more than the truth of paper. These were not lies, I insisted. These were translations from necessity to documentation. Sister Magdalena caught me once at my desk, the lamp throwing my shadow against the plaster like a duplicated man. She stood in the doorway with her hands hidden in her sleeves, the way she held them when she was keeping her temper. "You speak of God as if he is an accountant," she said. I kept writing. The poor need both, absolution and receipts. And which do you give more easily? I did not answer. She did not leave. We reached the edge of something the Church does not teach us to cross: sister against priest, conscience against command. Finally, she said, very quietly, "If you change the numbers to fit the miracle, what happens when a miracle arrives and finds no numbers willing to hold it?" When she walked away, the room felt colder. I pulled the lamp closer and wrote a supplier name that did not exist: Agua Santa Distribution. As the letters formed, I felt the thrill of forging a door and stepping through. The bishop noticed us. Bishops always notice miracles that can be photographed. He wrote me a short note, congratulations on administrative clarity and pastoral vigor. Clarity, vigor. I placed the letter in a frame above the desk and pretended I did not read it multiple times a day. With recognition came invitations. A Rotary Club luncheon where a man told me that generosity was capitalism with a conscience. A charity gala in a hotel ballroom so cold the lilies shivered in their vases. I wore a borrowed cassock that fit too well and stood with my hands folded as if I were perpetually about to bless someone. People pressed business cards into my palm like confessions. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted proof that help had been acknowledged. I learned the new sacraments of this world: metrics, transparency, impact. I made charts, bars rising, lines smoothing, narratives that turned chaotic mercy into shapes a boardroom could love. The night I printed the first full report, 12 pages of progress, I placed it on the altar, knelt, and whispered, "If this is vanity, Lord, let it at least be useful." The report traveled. A banker read it and called his cousin. A cousin spoke to a senator's aide. A woman with glossy hair and a watch that flashed like a small sun visited with a camera crew. She said she admired the way we aligned purpose with performance. Purpose with performance. I rolled the phrase on my tongue and wondered if God would prefer it to mercy and truth. Then Martin arrived. He drove up in a white SUV that looked like a confession that had never been asked to kneel. He wore a gold crucifix and called me Padrecito, with a warmth I wanted to trust. He toured the grounds, nodding the nod of men who estimate value by the angles of roofs and the number of taps that still work. He listened to the children sing, stood with me in the kitchen as Sister Anna stirred lentils thick as pennants, then asked to see the office. I showed him the ledgers. I showed him my charts. He did not read them. He watched me read them to him, and that seemed to satisfy something private in him. He wrote a check for 500,000 pesos and slid it across the desk, the world's smoothest absolution. "Use it how you see fit," he said. "The church trusts you." Later, I would understand that sentence as a trap. That day, I heard it as permission from heaven. Martín introduced me to men who used the language of virtue as if it were a currency, scalable, diversifiable, liquid. They came from construction companies and import-export firms and small banks that swelled into larger ones when elections approached. They wanted to do good, or to be seen as doing good, which I decided was the same for our Hungary. He taught me the phrase operational agility. With it, we opened a new account at a bank that offered minutes after Mass. We filed the Fundación San Miguel as a separate entity to streamline grant-making. We hired an accountant who wore cufflinks shaped like anchors and told me not to worry about things he called friction. Through Martín, we discovered that offshore did not mean illegal, it meant prudently outside the caprice of local chaos. The more I learned, the easier I slept. Ignorance is a sin for amateurs. Professionals need plausible deniability. I became a professional. Christmas came with lights that looked almost expensive. We had roast chicken, sweetbread, small gifts wrapped in paper printed with stars that peeled away with a sigh. During Silent Night, Sister Magdalena's face glittered with tears. She gripped my hand and whispered, "You did this." What I wanted to say, the chicken was funded through 3 transfers and a trust in Montevideo. The toys are written as educational materials purchased from a supplier incorporated by a lawyer who owes Martín a favor. What I said? No, sister, God did. After midnight, the chapel emptied. I sat alone with the candles, the wax puddling like melted halos. I thought of the offshore account. I thought of the new phone I had justified as necessary for donor relations. I thought of the wine I planned to open in the rectory, celebratory, symbolic, sacramental, take your pick. I whispered, "You understand, don't you? It's for them." The silence felt like a signature I forged on behalf of heaven. When I popped the cork, the hiss sounded like absolution. With money came a heightened sense of responsibility. It is a strange thing to admit, but corruption made me more careful. I triple-checked shipments. I instituted inventory controls. I documented every legitimate purchase so thoroughly that the illegitimate ones hid among them like pious sinners in a crowd. The sisters remarked on the new freezer, the spotless storage room, the way the pantry never fell below 2 weeks' supplies. I smiled and told them we were learning to steward abundance. The word abundance sat in my mouth a second too long. I swallowed it with water like a pill too big for my throat. The bishop visited, beard perfumed, hands soft, smile public. He praised our efficiency and invited me to deliver a talk on best practices for parish charities. I prepared slides. I spoke of closing the loop between donor intent and beneficiary need, of data-informed compassion. When applause rose in that hall of polished wood and inherited dignity, I felt a swell that a lesser man might call grace. I called it proof. In the Q&A, a young priest asked, "Father, what if the system fails the poor? What if the forms are designed to deny them?" I answered, "Then we improve the forms." I did not say, "Or we learn to write around them so elegantly no one notices." That night, the bishop's secretary shook my hand and said, "Rome appreciates priests who understand modern demands." Rome. The words slid into my bloodstream and warmed me. I began to travel. Buenos Aires, then Montevideo, then a conference in Rome on social impact faith initiatives. Each city's light imprinted itself on me, wide and yellow in Buenos Aires, hard and white in hotel corridors, holy and indifferent in Rome, where marble glowed as if God owned a quarry. I shared panels with men who said that transparency was the path to virtue. One had a bracelet of black beads he rotated while describing tax credit optimization. I told a story about a boy who stopped coughing because we found room in a budget for an inhaler. The room softened. I watched donors write my name in their calendars. After a dinner hosted by a Monsignor whose smile could sell salvation by the meter, a papal envoy lifted a glass and said, "The Church needs priests. Like you, Father. Men who understand capital." Polite applause, light on the surface, heavy underneath. I smiled and felt something crack. Not from pressure, but from the relief of acceptance. I had wanted to be seen by heaven. Instead, I was seen by its administrators, and the compliment glowed like a benediction made of gold leaf. In the hotel room, a bottle of champagne waited with a card that read, "Grazie per il suo servizio." I turned on the television. News showed drought near Córdoba, cattle ribs like barrels, women in line for water, men praying into hats. I opened the bottle anyway. The foam rose like confession denied. The more sacred my image became, the more private my bargains felt. I stopped seeking counsel from the sisters. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't want their faces to become mirrors. I could endure God's silence. I could not endure their eyes. I developed a vocabulary that justified any decision. Operational grace, strategic mercy, buffer liquidity. I extended our payroll temporarily from the reserve. I delayed remittances and then blurred them with other entries until even I could not separate one intention from another. I created a second vendor to pay the first vendor to reimburse us for supplies we might buy later if a donor asked. And in that sentence lies a map of hell drawn in neat professional lines. In quiet hours, the orphanage sounded like innocence itself. Soft footsteps, a cough disguised as a laugh, the mutter of a child speaking to a parent who no longer existed in the world, but lived vividly in memory. Those sounds were my defense in advance against any accusation I might one day face. I did it for them, I would say to the mezzanine of men who would decide my fate. And it would be true, which is what made it so persuasive to me. One afternoon, Magdalena placed a chipped mug of mate on my desk, sat without asking, and watched me work. I pretended not to feel her gaze like a pen pressing through the paper into the wood. "Do you ever miss praying?" she asked. "I pray." "You talk," she said gently, "to a God you have made simple because your spreadsheets are not." I set down my pen. "Do you think I'm lying, sister?" She considered the window. "No. I think you're building a world where lies are not precisely lies. and I think those worlds fall harder than the simple ones. I wanted to ask her which hungry child she would starve to preserve a form, which medicine she would leave upon a shelf because a signature was missing. Instead, I said, "Sometimes God's will arrives without a stamp." I meant it to wound. It did. She closed her eyes and nodded the way people nod just before they leave a room they love. The celebration that completed my conversion came in a square filled with choir voices and confetti blowing like communion gone feral. We had achieved a record year. The mayor offered a plaque. Cameras gulped the moment. I wore new vestments from Milan, white and gold, shimmering so brightly that even I wanted to kneel before myself. As I lifted the plaque, a wind rose. Candles tumbled in unison, a choreography of extinguishing. For a second, the crowd murmured, the collective intake of a city's breath when it has sensed a pattern. I heard a whisper, absurd and unmistakable. How much did faith cost this time? I turned the whisper into applause by raising my hands like a conductor inviting the next encore. The city obeyed. It always does when noise is easier than thought. That night, alone, I took the vestments off slowly, the fabric sighing like something relieved of duty. I folded them with a gentleness I reserved for the dying, and placed them in a drawer that smelled faintly of old wood and the future. The contract came soon after. A foreign NGO with a smiling representative and a rosary whose diamonds clicked like teeth. She praised our scalable compassion. She offered to triple our funding if I could smooth some paperwork that, frankly, benefits everyone. The documents were sleek, clause nested within clause like Russian dolls, and written by a lawyer who had never met a hungry child. I read enough to know what it was, and not enough to know what it would make of me. I signed. The devil's ink is not black. It's clear. You only see it when the paper catches light. With the contract, we became an enterprise. Donor relations shifted from warm letters to quarterly reports. Our mission statement adopted verbs that could be audited. The children learned to pose without blinking. I learned to sleep with a phone against my chest, heartbeat syncing to notifications from banks that assured me each morning that we were solvent, which is not the same as saved. In the chapel, I began to speak differently. My homilies turned towards stewardship, accountability, renewal through structure. The words were not false, but they were thinner. After Mass, Magdalena would straighten the altar linens and say nothing, an eloquence I did not know how to outtalk. When I prayed at night, I no longer asked for mercy. I asked for efficiency. I asked for networks to hold, for donors to remain aspirational, for the next child to arrive after the next transfer cleared. I told myself this was prudence baptized. Some nights, when the building settled and the refrigerator's hum lowered into a low animal growl, I thought I could hear the numbers whispering to me. Multiply us, hide us, save us. If I ever questioned whether the voice was God's, I stopped. It is easier to sanctify a whisper than to admit you're running out of silence. The letter from Rome took months to travel, but no time at all to pierce. It arrived plain, wax seal heavy with the confidence of institutions that survive centuries. But that is later. In these days, I believed I had found the secret to serving God in a broken economy. You adapt, you improvise, You bend forms into usefulness. The poor need more than charity. They need skill. And I, Emilio Salvatierra, had learned a skill the seminary never taught. Looking back, I wish the first fracture had resounded like prophecy, that the candle had sputtered in warning, that the spreadsheet had refused to balance. But descent, in my experience, is quiet. A staircase you walk without noticing each step has been designed to descend at exactly the pace of your rationalization. By then, I was so far down, I called it ground. I used to think holiness smelled like incense. Now I know it smells like paper. Paper has a sound, too. A dry, private sound, like small bones shifting in the dark. Every night I turned the pages of ledgers that no longer felt sacred, only necessary. Each line item whispered back to me, and I began to recognize my own handwriting as both confession and sin. When the money came, everything glowed. The courtyard was resurfaced, the dormitory walls repainted white, the children's shoes replaced in neat pairs like miniature promises. For once, San Miguel looked like what the world wanted mercy to look like: tidy, photographable, exportable. We installed a water tank, hired a gardener, bought new hymnals. Every peso accounted for on paper, every lie wrapped in scripture. The sisters smiled again. Donors sent congratulatory letters, and the bishop called me an example of modern stewardship. I started wearing pressed cassocks with clean cuffs. I stopped walking to the market. Martine sent a driver. I no longer ate with the children. I ate with the benefactors. At first, it was politeness, then convenience, then preference. I told myself that comfort was a tool, that a priest who appeared successful inspired confidence, and confidence brought charity. When a donor offered me a weekend at his family's vineyard, I went to thank him personally. When a company sent me a leather briefcase for field work, I used it. When the new phone arrived for international coordination, I accepted. Each gift, small in isolation, accumulated into a theology of permission. My sermons began to change. I spoke less about humility and more about growth. Less about sacrifice, more about empowerment. The congregation applauded my optimism. They liked the priest who smiled through crisis. They liked that I made poverty sound manageable. I liked it too. One night I traveled to Buenos Aires for a donor gala. The ballroom shimmered. Gold chandeliers, white tablecloths, waiters moving in precise formation. A senator clapped my shoulder and said, "Padre Emilio, you make faith look efficient." I raised my glass and smiled. Inside, something cracked. Because that's what I'd wanted to hear all along. Not that I was holy, but that I was competent. Later that evening, when I returned to the hotel, I stood before the mirror in my collar and realized that holiness had quietly changed uniforms. Martine and I became partners in everything except confession. He spoke of opportunities, a word that in business means temptation written in polite ink. We registered a new branch of the foundation in Uruguay to protect assets from local volatility. The papers were clean, the accountants precise, the lies nearly invisible. We moved money between accounts, between charities, between languages. Pesos became dollars. Dollars became trust. Trust became faith. Each transfer looked legitimate, a rosary of transactions designed to blur into virtue. I told myself I was protecting the orphanage from collapse, that only the immoral refused to adapt. Adaptation became my religion. During a visit to Rome, I met a cardinal at a private dinner. The table was long, covered in white linen. The wine came from Tuscany. The laughter came from experience. He raised his glass to me. "We need more priests like you, men who understand that the church must evolve." The word evolve lingered. It sounded noble, but I knew what it meant. Accommodate sin gracefully. After the dinner, I walked through St. Peter's Square, under the marble gaze of saints. Tourists were gone. The square was hollow, echoing with footsteps that might have been mine or another man's centuries ago. I looked at the basilica dome and whispered, "If this is evolution, Lord, what am I becoming?" The wind gave no answer. I went back to my hotel room and checked the latest wire transfer before sleeping. At San Miguel, we built a new dining hall. The marble tiles gleamed under soft yellow lights. The donors loved it. The bishop blessed it. The children, confused, called it the palace. I began hosting luncheons there, not for the orphans, but for investors. Each table became a confessional. Each toast, a transaction disguised as gratitude. We drank Malbec from crystal glasses engraved with the foundation's emblem. Sister Magdalena refused to attend. She said the food tasted too clean, the wine too proud. Once, she stood by the kitchen door and whispered, "The devil doesn't always come with smoke, Father. Sometimes he comes with catering." I laughed, too loudly. But that night I dreamt of her words as a flame eating through paper. To impress Rome, I compiled a 40-page impact summary. Color-coded graphs, photos of smiling children, testimonials edited for grace. One chart, titled Projected Growth of Beneficiary Reach 2023 to 2025, showed a steady upward line. In truth, the orphanage had reached capacity months ago. But hope, like inflation, can always be adjusted. When the report was published, it went viral in church networks. Rome requested a copy for best practice distribution. A priest in Chile wrote to me calling my methods divinely quantitative. I framed that email beside the bishop's letter. Two blessings, side by side. Success is a fever disguised as light. It burns quietly until it becomes the air you breathe. I started waking at 3 a.m., heart racing, thoughts filled with numbers, exchange rates, donor deadlines. The children's faces blurred into data points. Once, during confession, a child told me he had stolen an apple from the pantry. I told him God forgave him before I even said the words. But when I left the booth, I felt as if I'd confessed nothing myself, as if I were the one hiding the fruit behind my back. It was during the third audit that I began to see the cracks. The accountant, a young woman from Buenos Aires, asked for receipts I'd never intended to exist. I fabricated them overnight, printing fake invoices under the soft hum of the copier. Each page slid out warm and fragrant, like sin still steaming from creation. When she returned the next day, she smiled politely and said, "Everything seems in order." The relief that washed over me was almost divine. Almost. By then, I'd stopped praying the rosary. I told myself I was too busy, but the truth was simpler. I no longer believed I could pray and sign contracts with the same hands. The ledger had become my crucifix, each column a bead, each balance a whispered amen. Faith had turned to arithmetic, and arithmetic, as my father once said, never lies. I was the only liar left. The Vatican's interest in my foundation was inevitable. We'd grown too visible, too perfect. Miracles draw audits. Martin said not to worry. We've built something untouchable, he told me. Even Rome won't break it. But I remembered Sister Magdalena's words. God watches most closely when men say untouchable. I nodded, smiled, pretended calm. Inside, I knew the fall had already begun. That night, I walked through the empty chapel. The crucifix gleamed faintly in the dark. I looked up and said, I did everything for you. Why does it feel like I'm the one who needs saving? No answer. Only the wind, slipping through the broken window. Soft, persistent, unaccounted for. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Plain envelope, Vatican seal, weight heavier than paper should carry. Inside, only 4 sentences. Polite, sterile sentences that could kill a man. The Congregation for Clerical Affairs will conduct a full audit of Fundación San Miguel. Please prepare all financial documentation for review. I read it 3 times. Each time, the words grew smaller. Then I folded the letter neatly, placed it beside the ledger, and whispered to myself, It's fine. Everything is in order. It wasn't. They arrived quietly, 2 men in black suits, one carrying a leather folder, the other a tablet that reflected the crucifix above my desk. They were polite in that Vatican way, courtesy sharpened into precision. Father, the older one said, we'll just need a few clarifications. They smiled the way surgeons do before anesthesia. For 3 days they worked in silence. Their questions were surgical cuts. Why were these receipts identical? Why does this supplier not appear in the registry? Why were funds transferred to an overseas account under your authorization? Each answer I gave was a prayer written in panic. I quoted regulations, cited emergencies, invoked God's mercy. They nodded, typed, and thanked me. When they left, they said, "We appreciate your cooperation." But the word cooperation felt like an epitaph. That night, I burned the drafts. Extra invoices, alternative ledgers, backup USB drives. The smoke rose through the small chapel window. I imagined it reaching heaven and wondered what burnt paper smells like to God. By dawn, the ashes looked like snow on the desk. I brushed them into a chalice and whispered, "For the children." Rumors move faster than faith. Within a week, the local papers began to hum. Mismanagement of charity funds. Priest under investigation for fraud. The bishop called me. His tone was administrative, not pastoral. "Emilio," he said, "until this is resolved, you are to step down temporarily. The Vatican is freezing your accounts." "My accounts?" I asked. "Everything," he said. Then, softer, "It's not God you've disappointed, Father. It's the paperwork." That sentence gutted me more than the accusation, because it was true. Within 2 weeks, the orphanage starved. The refrigerators buzzed with nothing inside. The pantry shelves echoed when opened. The sisters lined up the children and told them we were fasting. Un ayuno santo. They believed us. Children are good at believing in holy hunger. Sister Magdalena sold her rosary beads for bread. I tried wiring money from the hidden account, but it was frozen too. Faith, caught in bureaucratic ice. When I told the children to pray before bed, their voices trembled not from piety, but from emptiness. Each amen sounded like the clinking of coins I no longer had. One night, I stayed in the office long after everyone slept. The ledgers were open, the ink dark as confession. I tore pages out, fed them into a metal bin, and watched them burn. The flames danced against the crucifix on the wall, painting it in orange light. Christ seemed to look down not in anger, but exhaustion. Sister Magdalena entered quietly. "Stop," she said. "I can't," I whispered. "If I burn the lies, maybe he'll only see the ashes." She took my wrist. Her hand was strong, rough from work. "God already saw, Emilio. He saw before you wrote the first number." Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with clarity. "You weren't feeding them. You were feeding yourself." The words didn't sound like accusation. They sounded like truth, refusing to stay silent. I dropped the ledger. The fire consumed the last page, the one labeled Faith Disbursement Log. When it was over, the room smelled of ink and smoke and finality. The next morning, men from the diocese came. They told me to pack. No uniform, no public goodbye. The children gathered at the gate, their small hands gripping the bars. I wanted to tell them something noble, that God still loved them, that their prayers mattered. But I couldn't lie anymore. So I just said, "Be good," and walked away. Sister Magdalena pressed a small wooden cross into my palm. "You'll need this where you're going," she said. I thought she meant prison, but the punishment was quieter than that. They sent me to Mendoza, to a small chapel surrounded by vineyards, where no one knew my name. Exile, disguised as reassignment. The chapel was old, half abandoned. The bell had no clapper, the pews smelled of mildew. At first, I tried to continue as before, morning prayers, inventory, small repairs. But faith without witnesses feels like talking to a locked door. The vineyards stretched endlessly, vines twisting in the wind like penitent arms. I worked among them, cutting, pruning, sweating under the sun. Every cut felt like a penance, every vine a line of scripture rewritten in dirt. At night, I lay awake, hearing the wind pass through the leaves. It sounded like whispers from Cordoba, voices of children counting their breaths before sleep. I wondered if they still said grace before meals, even when there was no meal. Guilt doesn't arrive like thunder. It seeps in, a slow drizzle that never ends. It fills the gaps between thoughts, rewrites every memory. I began to dream of coins falling like rain. In the dreams, I tried to catch them, but every coin I touched melted into ash. Sometimes I'd wake whispering, "For the children," as if that could still save me. But even my own voice had grown suspicious of me. Months later, the newspapers published the verdict. Priest launders charity funds. Vatican confirms mismanagement. They printed my face beside a crucifix, as if the paper itself wanted to crucify me properly. People in town spat when they recognized me. One man threw a handful of coins at my feet. "There's your communion, Padre," he shouted. The coins hit the dirt with a metallic rain. For a moment, I thought about picking them up, then realized that even poverty couldn't make me touch them again. I began fasting deliberately, at first out of penance, then out of routine, then because it was the only thing I could control. Hunger felt honest. It didn't lie, didn't justify, didn't rationalize. It simply existed, a clean ache that demanded nothing but acknowledgement. In that emptiness, I began to sense something close to faith again. Not the triumphant kind that fills churches, but the small flicker that survives in the ruins. One night, lightning struck the chapel roof. The sound was like a bell shattering. When I entered, I saw the crucifix split clean down the middle. The figure of Christ lay on the floor, one arm broken, one eye blackened with soot. I knelt before it and whispered, "Now you know how it feels." I don't know if that was blasphemy or communion, but it was the first time in months that I felt seen. I picked up the pieces and set them on the altar. The next morning, I nailed them back together, crooked, imperfect, but standing again, just like me. That was the moment I realized punishment wasn't exile. It was continuation. Forced, quiet, relentless. You don't die after sin. You live in its shadow. You keep breathing, and each breath weighs more than the last. Silence has a texture. It isn't smooth, not clean. It's layered like dust. Here in Mendoza, it coats everything. The pews, the vines, even the air between my ribs. I wake before dawn to sweep it, and by noon it settles again. The diocese forgot me quickly, which I accepted as grace. My only congregation are the farmers who stop by to leave grapes at the chapel door. They don't ask for confession, they ask for rain. They still call me Padre, though they say it as if testing whether the word still fits. At first, I answered their faith with rehearsed humility. Nod, smile, bless. Later, I stopped pretending. I learned that silence blesses more honestly than words. I opened the confessional one morning out of habit. The booth smelled of old varnish and ghosts. I sat inside for hours, waiting for a knock that never came. On the third day, an old man entered. He confessed that he had stolen grapes from his neighbor's vines. His voice shook with shame. When he finished, he asked softly, "What about you, Father? What do you confess?" I stared at the lattice screen. The sunlight through it made a pattern on my hands, a cross of small squares. I wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't form. My sin was too large to fit through those holes. He waited. When I said nothing, he nodded, as if I had told him everything. "Then we're both thieves," he said, and left. After that, I kept the confessional open every morning. No one came again, but I stayed, listening to the wood breathe, the wind shifting through cracks. It was the closest thing to prayer I could manage. I started counting. Not money, not souls, but moments. How many nights since Cordoba? How many names had I buried under the weight of my calculations? Forgiveness, I realized, is a form of accounting, too. Except here, the numbers never add up. When I tried to list my crimes, they multiplied. One lie begot 3 explanations. One signature spawned a dozen falsified receipts. One good intention erased 50 truths. Sin is exponential. And yet, guilt isn't enough. It's too self-absorbed, too circular. I had spent years feeding it like an idol. I began to suspect that forgiveness wasn't about balance. It was about surrendering the very idea of balance. I stopped trying to justify anything. I stopped trying to be understood. That was when the nightmares softened. Sister Magdalena came months later. She looked smaller, the sharpness around her eyes replaced by a patient sorrow. She stood at the chapel door as though afraid the building might reject her. "You've grown thin," she said. "So have you," I replied. We sat among the vines. The air smelled of ripening fruit and approaching rain. "The orphanage is gone," she told me. "They closed it after the audit. The children were sent away." I nodded. My hands trembled. "Do you hate me?" I asked. She looked at the mountains. "No. You were trying to save us. You just forgot who the us was." Before she left, she placed a small notebook on the altar. "Names," she said. "Every child we cared for. Some are dead, some lost. I thought you should have them." When she walked away, the chapel door stayed open. The wind turned the pages by itself. That night, I read each name aloud. Juanito, Maria, Diego, Luz. Each syllable cracked something inside me. I imagined their faces as numbers once, tidy in my spreadsheets. Now they stared back as ghosts who refused to be reconciled. I didn't ask God to forgive me. I asked Him to remember them better than I did. There is a difference between praying for mercy and praying for memory. When you beg for mercy, you still think you matter. When you beg for memory, you just hope your absence leaves something kind behind. I began to light a candle every morning for one name. One candle, one child. When the wick burned down, I whispered, "Presente." Some days I ran out of candles before I ran out of names. On those days I counted the smoke. It came without seal, just a typed line and a signature I didn't recognize. "Your case is considered closed." May God account for what man cannot. I stared at it for a long time. The phrase felt both merciful and cruel. Merciful because it meant the world was finished with me. Cruel because God was not. I burned the letter over the candle flame. The paper curled inward, glowing red at the edges. For the first time in years, I felt no panic, only quiet. The ash fell onto the altar cloth like gray snow. I brushed it away with the back of my hand, careful not to disturb the candle. I used to think faith was something grand, like a cathedral ceiling. Now I think it's smaller, something you carry in your pocket, folded, fragile. Every morning I walk through the vines and pick one grape, press it between my fingers, watch the juice stain my skin. It's a reminder. Sweetness requires pressure, and too much pressure ruins it. When villagers come to ask for blessings, I pour them a glass of the chapel wine. "Drink," I tell them, "for patience." They nod. They don't know it's my communion, too. Late one night, I wrote a note and tucked it inside the old ledger that survived the fire. It said, "Father, forgive my math." I learned too late that numbers can't quantify hunger or grace. I closed the book and sealed it with wax. I didn't know who I wanted to find it. Perhaps no one. Perhaps God, if He still audited men like me. Then I blew out the candle and sat in the dark. The smell of smoke lingered, faintly sweet, almost like forgiveness. I didn't find redemption here in Mendoza. I found endurance. And maybe that's all redemption ever was. Not cleansing, but continuing. Each day I keep count, not of pesos or sins, but of breaths I take without lying. Some days I only reach 3. Morning arrives here like a forgiveness you never asked for. Slow, pale, patient. The air is cold at first, smelling of wet soil and crushed grapes. The vineyard wakes before I do, vines whispering softly, as if counting prayers in leaf form. I start each day sweeping the chapel floor. The broom's rhythm feels like breath. Inhale, exhale, repeat. Dust rises in golden shafts through cracked windows. I no longer fight it. I let it dance. I am still a priest, technically. I wear the collar when the villagers visit, though it feels less like authority now and more like memory. They come to light candles, to bless the harvest, to ask for words I no longer have. When I speak, I keep it simple. Work with care, I tell them. Share what you can. Forgive quickly. They smile, not because the words are wise, but because they are enough. On Sundays, a handful of families gather in the chapel. We don't call it Mass anymore. There's no organ, no choir, no gilded chalice. Just a table, a loaf of bread, and wine we made ourselves from last season's grapes. We begin in silence. The children fidget. The adults bow their heads. I break the bread with my hands, rough, uneven, human, and say, "This isn't holy." It's honest. They nod. We eat. We drink. We share stories. Afterward, no one says Amen. We just sit together while the wind moves through the open doors. It isn't faith as I once knew it, but something smaller, humbler. Faith without marketing. Sometimes I write letters I'll never send. To Rome, to Martine, to the bishop, to Sister Magdalena, to the children. They all begin the same way. I'm sorry. But sorrow, I've learned, is not communication. It's sediment. It settles quietly, layer by layer, until it becomes part of you. I keep the letters in a wooden box behind the altar. Beside them lies the small notebook of names Magdalena left. Each page is soft from handling, the ink faded but still legible. Every night I open it, trace one name with my finger, and whisper, "You are still accounted for." A few months ago, a young man arrived on a motorcycle. Dust clung to his jeans, and his smile was hesitant. "Padre Emilio?" he asked. "Yes." He grinned. "You don't remember me. I was one of your kids, at San Miguel." The world went still. His voice carried something I hadn't heard in years. Not accusation, but warmth. "You saved my life," he said. "You found me a doctor when I was sick. You gave me shoes," I wanted to say. "I also stole your future, your trust, your innocence." But I couldn't. He hugged me before I could speak. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. Then he left, leaving the sound of his engine and the scent of dust behind. I sat in the doorway for a long time after he was gone. When the wind blew through, it smelled faintly of Cordoba, smoke, metal, rain. That night, I slept without dreams. Every evening, I walk the vineyard rows. The soil clings to my boots. The vines curve like ribs of something ancient and forgiving. I've learned that pruning requires precision and mercy, the same balance faith once demanded of me. Cut too little, and rot spreads. Cut too much, and the vine bleeds dry. Somewhere between is survival. Sometimes, while trimming, I whisper a prayer. For every lie, a seed. For every greed, a grape. For every hunger I caused, may I feed another. It's not liturgy, it's labor. but maybe they're the same thing now. The local kids help after school. They laugh easily, chasing each other between rows, shouting my name when I pretend not to hear. They remind me of the orphans, but lighter, unburdened by institutions and faith measured in peso signs. One girl, maybe 10, once asked, "Padre, do you still talk to God?" I told her the truth. "Not much, but I listen." She smiled. "Maybe he talks too quietly." Out of the mouths of children, I thought. When she left, I looked up at the hills, and for a brief second I believed she was right, that maybe God hadn't gone silent at all. Maybe he was just whispering low enough for humility to hear. It took me years to understand the final shape of forgiveness. It's not a light that erases darkness. It's a light that lives inside it. I confess still, but not to a priest. I confess to the vines, to the sky, to the faces I can't remember clearly anymore. I confess to time itself. Each morning I begin again with the same words. "Father, forgive my math." But now I add, "And thank you for not balancing the books." Because if God truly balanced things, there'd be no mercy left. One dawn, after rain, the chapel filled with the smell of wet earth and candle smoke. I lit a single candle on the altar. The flame trembled, almost went out, then steadied. I took the small wooden cross, the one Magdalena had given me the day I fell, and placed it beside the candle. I whispered, "For everything that was false, something true remains." Outside, the vineyard shimmered. Drops of water hung from the vines like tiny halos. For a moment, the world felt accounted for. Grace, I've learned, isn't abundance. It's hunger that refuses to die. It's the ache that teaches you to hold on to the little that's left. I used to feed children with forged money. Now, I feed strangers with bread I made myself. Neither act was perfect, but one was honest. When I die, they will find the notebook of names, the letters, the burnt ledger sealed with wax. Maybe they'll understand that redemption was never the absence of sin, only the courage to live with its echo. Until then, I'll keep sweeping, pruning, pouring wine. Each act small, deliberate, human. Each day I count not the sins, but the chances to begin again. And at night, before the candle burns out, I whisper one final line. "Father, forgive my math, but let my hunger count for something."